Fellow risk takers, this is your worst. Podcast host Andrew Stotz from A. Stotz Academy, continuing my discussion with Larry Swedroe, who for 3 decades was the head of research at Buckingham Wealth Partners. You can learn more about his story in episode 645. Larry's unique because he understands the academic research world as well as the practical world of investing. Today, we are talking about chapter 10 in his recent book, Enrich Your Future, the Keys to Successful Investing. The chapter is talking about when even the best aren't likely to win. And again, this is the first part of part 2, strategic I said petroleum again, huh? Portfolio. I am the worst podcast host, Larry. Strategic portfolio decisions, Larry, take it away.
Yeah, Andrew, it's good to be back. As you know, we like to start off each chapter with a story or a legend or a myth or something to help people understand a difficult concept. If they can get the concept in an area they're more familiar with, then it's easier to understand it in finance. So in this case, we try to ask the question, what do you do when even the best aren't likely to win? Okay, so the story I came up with is a wizard appears, waves his magic wand, and makes Andrew Stotz the 11th best golfer in the world. And being the 11th best golfer in the world, you get invited to the Legends of the Golf World annual tournament. That's the good news. The bad news, of course, is the other 10 players are the 10 best players in the world. Now, to make this a little bit fairer competition, or to give Andrew a handicap, what the rules say is this. Andrew, you get to sit in the clubhouse while each of the players goes out and plays a hole one at a time. And you don't get to watch, how they play, but you get to hear their scores. And once you hear all 10 players' scores, you have a choice you can make. You could take par and don't have to play, or you could decide to play and get whatever score you get, okay? Now, first hole's a par 4. 8 of the 10 players shoot a bogey 5. 1 shoots par, and 1 shoots a birdie. What's your strategy, Andrew?
So it seems like I should take par because that was a damn hard hole, it seems like, from just those observations.
Right. If you take par, you're ahead of 8 of the 10 players. You're tied with the 9th, and you're only behind 1 stroke to the 10th player.
I'm in second place.
You're in second place, or at least tied for second. And if every hole played out that way, unless the same player got the birdie, you would likely win the tournament. So what's the thinking here? Why do you choose not to play? Because here you're playing against the 10 best players in the world, and you don't have any advantage over them. So why would you try to succeed when they have failed? Now let's change the situation. They play on day 1, and it's a windy, miserable day. Winds are blowing 30 miles an hour. The greens are soaked, making it very slick and difficult. You get to play the next morning when it's absolutely beautiful out, sun's out, course is dry. Well, then you might say, I've got a big advantage. Maybe they got those bogeys because of the difficult conditions, right? So there you see an advantage. And if you have an advantage over the best, okay, then you might choose to play the game. What does this all have to do with investing? So the way I think about it is this. Who are the people most likely to succeed in the world of investing? I would suggest one hypothesis would be the big, large pension plans that manage tens of billions of dollars, the Harvards and Yales of the world, and big corporations. They also have plans that manage tens of billions of dollars, and every one of the great money managers in the world are clamoring to get the fees to try and manage that. So they have.
And let me stop you there, just for people that may not understand the pension system and all of that. We have public mutual fund companies like Vanguard, we've talked about, and Fidelity and those type that are offering public, funds to the public. But here you have money that's pooled from retirement investment accounts for government employees. And this is a huge pool of money. This is not a small pool of money. And therefore, what you're claiming is that because this is such a huge pool of money and they have a high obligation through ERISA requirements and all of that, that these men and women have the resources to be at the absolute top of the game. And we'll also add one other thing. Their time horizon is super long. So they also have the ability to make maybe some unconventional decisions, some more odd or alternative allocations. So it seems like they would have all advantages. Continue.
Yeah, so I listed 6 advantages, if my memory serves, that they had. One is they have access to all these great managers, not just the Vanguards of the world, and other good families, BlackRock and et cetera, dimensional fund advisors, but they have access to all these big private vehicles that you and I wouldn't have access to because we don't have tens of billions of dollars and they don't want to bother with you. Number 2 is they pay much lower fees because of their scale. You might, if you even had access to a big pension plan fund manager, they might charge you 80 basis points and charge them 30. So that's a big advantage that they have. I think we can also agree, Andrew, that it's not even remotely possible that any one of these pension plans has ever hired a manager with a bad track record. Would you hire a manager with a bad, right? Not going to happen. It's also safe to say that they hired only managers who made great presentations to their due diligence committees, right? They showed how smart they were, explained their strategies. They also have an advantage that you and I don't have. These managers get to meet with all of these managers and the big companies doing due diligence, meeting with them personally, right? That you and I don't have to, we don't have access to. And another advantage they have is many of them, if not most, hire world-class consultants like SEI and Frank Russell and Goldman Sachs to help them do this due diligence and hire only the very best, right? So, if you can't think of an advantage, then you shouldn't play. And what advantage could we possibly have over them? All right. So that's the problem. So what's the analogy? Well, you could take par simply by investing in systematic strategies that access certain factors or total market funds run by fund families like Vanguard, which runs index funds, or systematic factor strategy funds run by companies like Dimensional and AQR and Avantis. These are big world-class firms hiring, the best mathematicians and scientists in their field to help them. And you don't have to pay big fees. You don't have to try to outperform. You could take par. And when you do that, here's what the evidence says. There have been a bunch of studies done on pension plans. I think it was Richard Ennis, if my memory serves, did a study. He found something like 2% of them succeeded in outperforming appropriate risk-adjusted benchmark, which is consistent with the studies that we've talked about before on choosing active fund managers. So if you're 98% likely to fail and you don't have any advantages, in fact, you're disadvantaged, you're paying higher fees, etc., then you shouldn't play the game. So that's our moral of the story. Unless you can identify an advantage that you have, like you get to play on a sunny day versus a rainy day, right? Then you shouldn't try to play.
The most obvious question that comes up in my mind, and for I'm sure plenty of the listeners and viewers, is then why does it continue on? Why are pension funds doing that over and over again, given this compelling, overwhelming evidence?
Yeah. Well, number one is sadly, certainly in the United States, and my speaking to investors all around the world, their education systems have totally failed the public. Despite its importance, money issues, even savings and learning not to use credit cards, except as a payment that you could make for convenience and you're going to pay it off, learning how to keep a checkbook and those things, let alone investing. It just isn't taught. And where it is taught, it's somebody from Morgan Stanley or Merrill Lynch who comes in and is pitching their active strategies. That's problem one. Unless you take an MBA in finance today, it's likely you haven't taken a single course in capital markets theory. So unless you've read my books or others like John Bogle's or William Bernstein's, you're going to be unaware of all of this information. The second part, there is what I would call a conspiracy among the active managers in the media who want to make sure the public is unaware so they don't have to, because they need you to tune in and watch their shows so they could sell commercials. And the active managers need you to believe that they're likely to win so they could collect the big fees. So they don't want you to know. And finally, there's all kinds of behavioral biases. Even when people are aware of the studies, they think, well, I'm a doctor. I'm clearly smarter than average. I can outperform. And so they're overconfident of their abilities, which is an all too human trait. And even though 98% fail, I can succeed. The only logical reason, I think, to play the game of active management is if one, you can truly identify an advantage you have, like you really have inside information, but you got to be careful because it's illegal to trade on it. And the other is you place a very high value on the entertainment, like some people like to go to Las Vegas. Well, you can go to Las Vegas and take 500 or $1,000 if you can afford to lose it and have as much fun as the guy who bets $1 million in Las Vegas. You don't need to spend the $1 million. So if you want, take 1 or 2% of your portfolio, go play, but expect to lose.
And one of the counter arguments to what you said is the idea that, well, okay, there hasn't been a lot of education, but the people running the pension funds have certainly been educated. Now, in Thailand, what you can see is, and I'm sure it's all the same around the world. Well, whose money is that pension money? Well, it's the average worker and employee of the government and the like. So we have a government pension fund here. We have a Social Security fund in Thailand. And what you find is that the people on the committee representing the beneficiaries have no knowledge at all of finance. And
they're typically political appointees who don't know finance. And number two, who's taking them to the golfing events and the big dinners and sporting events? It's not Vanguard or Dimensional. It's Morgan Stanley and their equivalents.
Yeah, so therefore you can say these leaders of pension funds are under pressure that is maybe illogical, unreasonable pressures, but they have to bow to them. That's one.
Or they just enjoy those expensive steak dinners and the golf at the beautiful country club.
Well, and as a sell side analyst, I traveled to the US quite many, many times, in my career to visit the amazing offices in San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York and all the different pension fund offices and the perks that go with it. So yeah, it's an interesting one. But I think, what you're summing it up of all of that, I think the conclusion out of all this is that the best equipped, best advantaged guys, men and women at the top of that don't outperform. As you said, the research, I couldn't find this particular research, but I'm going to keep looking for it and see if I can put it in a link to it in the show note. But the research basically shows that pretty much they never outperform over the long run.
Yeah, there's a bunch of papers trying to University of Arizona professor who's now works with Avantis. I forgot his name, Suhail perhaps, but he's done work on pension plans. My other books have cited studies on pension plan performance. So you can look in those books and they'll cite those studies. And they're all consistent.
Yeah.
Now, what's really important to keep in mind is neither you or I are saying it's impossible to outperform. That's what keeps the hope alive. There's always somebody out there who outperforms. The problem is it's a loser's game, meaning while it's possible to win, the odds of doing so are so poor, you shouldn't try unless you're placing a very high amount of value on the entertainment aspect and you get to brag at the 18th hole or 19th hole with your friends. Oh, I beat the market. Now, of course, you never tell them the other 40 years in a row you underperform, but you get tell that one story.
Yeah, I think what I tell my students now after having these discussions is that when you see someone outperforming, you must first absolutely assume it was because of luck. Because
The odds are, I would say it this way, the odds are great that it was likely luck. Doesn't mean it wasn't skill, right? We know there have been a handful of managers over time who have evidence skill. Warren Buffett certainly, but his skill disappeared because everyone figured out his secret sauce.
yeah, well, that's what on page 70, you at the end of one portion of it, you say, Warren, unless when you look in the mirror, you see Warren Buffett staring back at you, it doesn't seem likely that the answer to any of these questions is yes. At least it won't be yes if you're honest with yourself. In other words, we don't have an advantage. And you've already taught us that, yeah, Warren Buffett even lost that advantage because of the competitiveness of the market for the last 20 years. So, bingo. Well, that was a great one, Larry. And I think I want to just wrap up this one by talking just briefly about about this the concept of why are we talking about portfolios as opposed to originally in the first section we were talking about the efficient market and understanding about stock picking. Just give us a little foreshadowing and anything else you want to add as we wrap up.
Yeah, we talk about portfolios here because we're big believers in the benefits of diversification across unique asset classes that have premiums but are uncorrelated or lowly correlated. So we don't put all our eggs in one basket. The traditional line is diversification is really the only free lunch in investing. And so we want to encourage you to eat as much as possible of it. While on that subject, though, there was a brand new paper that just came out. I wrote it up this morning, and I think it will highlight an important issue for your listeners. So, one of the things we know investors do is they get caught up in the hype of something new and exciting, right? Herd mentality. And we have something today, which has been a repeat of many incidences in the past. And today it is hype around AI and what it could do to change the world. Well, we had similar things around the turn of the century with the internet. Now we had in the 60s, electronics revolution. In the 20s, it was all about, electrification, TV, radios, airplanes, all of this stuff, right? And we had bubbles in every case. Prices went crazy. This paper looked at what happens to the performance of stocks that enter the 10 largest companies on the US stock exchanges, okay? In the period after they become a top 10 and the period before they become a top 10. So if you look at the data, I'm going to do this from memory, but since I wrote it this morning, I think we're pretty safe here. If you, I think it was the 10 years before they entered, their returns were only slightly better than average, like 11.8%. In the 5 years before they got there, returns were unbelievable 20%. And in the 3 years, it's 27.8%. So that's how you get to be there.
In the 3 years prior.
Prior to becoming a top 10.
Okay.
Now everybody knows these companies. They're now the stars. They're written up in the media. They're in the Max 7. And we love these kind of money chases them. Fear of missing out is the key word here as well. And so this study then looked at, okay, what happens in the period after that?
And it's interesting that just for people that don't understand these types of studies, I believe this would be called an event study, where the event would
Yes.
be the entry into the index as, let's call that, time zero.
Right.
So
That's
you're
right. But in
talking
this
about,
case, it's not an index, it's the entire CRISP universe.
right. Okay.
All right. In the 3 years after they entered, they lost 50 basis points a year. In the 5 years after, they lost 1.5% a year. This isn't relative to the market. This is outright returns. And then in the 10 years, they lost, I think it was 1.9% a year. So most people didn't get those early great returns because, they waited. Now it's safe. These are great companies. They're in the top 10. Surely they're safe. And they go on. That's what we would call creative destruction. Originally, they were the destructors, but you don't own them then tend to. And then they get destructed by change, etc. And I looked at it just in writing it up. I thought I would look back and say, 10 years ago, what are the top 10 companies at the start of this year? And what were the top 10 companies in 2014? And interesting, we had 40% turnover. 4 of the top 10 today were not in the top 10 just 10 years ago. And none of the top 10 today, not a single one, was in the top 10 in 1994. So none of those companies who were top 10 companies in 1994 were in there. And these were world-class. Everyone thought were the greatest companies in the world. The IBMs, of the world,
trees don't
and
grow to the
General
sky.
Electrics. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And for anybody, listening and viewing, just follow Larry and you'll see his publishing of all of these. I do want to mention a book now that you talked about the AI revolution, that I found. I have a stack of books, about 7 books that I consider to be like life-changing for me or mind-changing. And this is one of them. It's called Future Hype, and it's called The Myths of Technology Change. And it's written by a guy named Bob Seidensticker. And he basically wrote, here's just a quick review. Everyone knows that today's rate of technological change is unprecedented. With technological breakthroughs from the internet to cell phones to digital music and pictures, everyone knows that the social impact of technology has never been as profound. But everybody is wrong.
That's right.
And that is the beginning of how it's listed on Amazon. But
I'll give you 2 things that I learned over time. One is that, and this is it is typical that the big beneficiaries of the technology are often not the creators, but the users. Would you rather be the person who uses cell phones, or would you rather be the company and had stock and kept it in BlackBerry or Nokia, right? The airlines cumulatively over their lives have lost money, I believe. And yet that changed the world. And I don't know if that author cites this story, but this is the one that sticks with me the most. So you read about in 1850s or 1860s, it took about, maybe it was 7 to 10 days for a letter to get from New York City to California with using a stagecoach. Maybe it was even longer. And if you sent it by boat, it might have been like 3 weeks, around the Cape of Good Hope, or Cape Horn, whichever one it is there. And then they invented the telegraph, and then it's there in seconds. There's no technology today that you can invent that changed the world to that degree, going from 3. So now you can get it in a millisecond instead of 2 seconds
Yeah, and
versus 3 weeks,
he
right?
does talk about that. And one of the
Yeah.
stories too that I love reading the memoirs of Civil War generals, which I've read many of them, but the memoir of William Tecumseh Sherman, who happens to be the name of my great grandfather, by the way. But William Tecumseh Sherman basically was sent out to San Francisco by the U.S. military, and he had to take a boat. And that boat now, if he was sent out in the 1700s, he would have taken a boat, yes, around all the way, around
Right, under South
yeah,
America.
under South America, and then after that, he would have come up, and that would have taken about 6 months to get there. And then they cut that by 75% by opening up the Panama Canal, which is what he went through in his story as he talked about this harrowing journey. And he arrives at Monterey Bay, and his ship just disintegrates as it hits upon the rocks, and they're trying to evacuate the ship. This is let's say 1845, something like that, maybe. And he arrives right in
Well, then the Panama
1849.
Canal wasn't built yet, so they went overland across
Yes, they had
Panama.
they had to go overland, exactly. And then he talks about how the Panama Canal was built, and then he talks about how the stagecoach, sorry, how the railroads were built, and then he goes on, to the advancement, and he's just saying there's nothing in this world that is accelerating at that pace, and there probably never will be. And that is just a shocking thing because, as he says, we all think that the pace of technological change is, so fast these days. In
Well,
fact,
here,
it's slow.
since we're having fun telling these great stories, my favorite of all time is, do you know how Baron Rothschild, the English brother of the famous Rothschild family, made his fortune, his big fortune? They were already successful,
Was it
but his
carrier
big,
pigeons?
that's exactly right. They knew that Napoleon was defeated before everybody else. There was panic on the London Stock Exchange. British bonds were collapsing. And he got his carrier pigeon sent from his brother in France, and he knew, and he got up and put every penny he had to buy British bonds. And he, made a fortune. Now, think about trying to do that today, getting an advantage over a high frequency trader who's moved their computer systems like a mile closer to beat yours by a millisecond, right?
Yeah, and when those carrier pigeons were beating people that were traveling by horseback,
Right.
and boat and all of that to get there. So it's incredible the pace in those days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, Larry, that was a fun discussion and a great lesson and a great kickoff for this portfolio section. I want to thank you again for this, and I'm looking forward to the next chapter that we've got. And the next chapter coming up, ladies and gentlemen, is the Demon of
yeah,
Chance.
we'll give everybody a little lead. We're going to talk about the great success of the Larry Swedroe Investment Trust.
Whoa! Can't wait. Well, follow Larry on Twitter and also on LinkedIn, and you'll get all of this. This is your worst. Podcast host, Andrew Stotz saying, I'll see you on the upside.